LOK Publishing presents The Price of Penitence. Untold Tales of Kalda Short Story 5. By Dan Zangari and Robert Zangari. Author's Foreword. Since writing A Prince's Errand we wondered much about Scovis Tasivir, High Duke of Travadia. If you've read the novel you should also be wondering about him. This tale of Scovis is very much a byproduct of flipping the iceberg theory of world building on its head. While writing A Prince's Errand we made use of that method and showed a character that felt genuine. Though the reader never met Scovis, they knew of him. His role was pivotal, as Ilter's storyline couldn't have been possible without Scovis and his actions prior to the novel. So we took what we wrote and expanded it. Of all the stories, this one has been the most structured and confined. But, we were able to weave enough new content into the tale that made writing this story refreshing. As with the other short stories in this collection, Scovis's tale revolves around a central theme, the Cherisium religion. In this story you will discover insight into Cherisium that was not expressly said in A Prince's Errand. Details about the Feast of Sorrows are explained further, as well as the practices leading up to the feast by its participants, partakers of the feast, and the devoutes of Cherith. The driving internal conflict has some real-world relevance as it tackles change within religions. Scovis's tale is that of solidarity, and how he adjusts to external change. Of all the other stories in this collection, The Price of Penitence is closest in the timeline to A Prince's Errand than any other. In a way, it can be viewed as almost a prequel of sorts to Tales of the Amulet. The final line in this story takes place hours before the events of the prologue in A Prince's Errand, and for some readers it might prove a good jumping-off point into the series. Although The Price of Penitence can be read on its own, we strongly suggest reading A Prince's Errand first. There are not really spoilers in this short story, but you'll have a better appreciation for its contents if you read it after the novel. A significant amount of foreshadowing is included in it, more so than others in the collection. Dan Zangari and Robert Zangari. Salt Lake City, 2020. The Price of Penitence. 6492 CD. The city of Mindolarn, seat of the empire. Scovis Tasivir, High Duke of Travadia, was tired of lavish banquets and overdone parties. And the banquet at Hawkover's mansion this evening was no exception. Such practices were not in harmony with the tenets of Cherisium, especially not with the Feast of Sorrows less than 1 week away. Such frivolity, he thought, glancing to the night sky. Only one of Kalda's moons was full, but Kalarn's speckled greens and blues did little to illuminate the cobblestone pathways of Hawkover's mansion. Luckily, lightstone lanterns hovered above the path, held in the air by some form of magic. Kineticism, was it? Scovis did not make it a point to study the channels of power, he had no talent in the ways of magic. A soft chorus of insects chirped from manicured shrubbery beside the cobblestone path. If it were 1 month later, the pathways would be quiet. Oh, isn't this beautiful? Scovis glanced to his left, where his wife walked beside him, her arm linked with his. Alanya Tasivir was a tall woman, but she was not nearly as tall as Scovis. She was beyond beautiful, with a dark olive complexion. Alanya's dress, a crimson ball gown trimmed with golden lace, was as exquisite as she was. "I love those flowers," Alanya said, her tone full of intrigue and excitement. Those were not emotions one should exude with the Feast of Sorrows only days away. But Alanya wasn't a devout of Cherisium. Her refusal to embrace God had not bothered Scovis when he first married her 23 years ago. But of late, her lack of devotion had left him with a lingering loneliness. Alanya smiled as she admired the gardens, pointing to the red and yellow 7-petal flowers arrayed around the shrubbery. "We should line the guesthouse's solarium with those." Alanya brushed a loose strand of her brown hair from her face. She turned to Scovis, but her smile soon faded. "You look so serious." Alanya raised her free hand to her husband's cheek, her fingers cool. Alanya's touch was always cool, even during the hottest months of the year. Scovis pursed his lips. "You're not still upset, are you?" Alanya asked, narrowing her emerald eyes. "This is wrong," Scovis muttered, glancing down the path. More couples walked the pathways ahead of them. The women all wore ball gowns like Alanya while the men wore the typical formal garb of the Empire, stiff crimson coats embroidered with gold and yellow thread, ruffled cream-colored shirts, black trousers, and polished black boots. Scovis was dressed much like them, but with one additional accoutrement. "None of them are wearing the shroud," Scovis said, sighing. He glanced to his shoulders where his own shroud of devotion was draped. The shroud was made of diaphanous scarlet silk, and was as long as a man's arm span. The 7 emblems of Cherisium were embroidered upon the shroud with crimson threads, arrayed so the first emblem was at the center, with the even emblems on the right and odd emblems on the left. Men wore the shroud on their shoulders, draping the ends so they hung down the sides of their chests. Women covered their heads in the shroud, gathering their hair within it so both hair and shroud hung in front of their shoulders. Despite the difference in how men and women wore the shroud, the ends always dangled toward the wearer's waist. "Is that all you can think about?" Alanya asked, pulling away. The expression on her face was colder than her touch. "The tenets of your religion have changed, my dear Scovis. Your fellow devoutes have adapted. Why can't you?" Scovis flinched. "I cannot change who I am, Alanya." Prior to leaving their mansion here in the city of Mindolarn, the capital of the Empire, Alanya had told him to leave the shroud behind. Few people wore the shroud in public these days. 3 years ago the spiritual leader of Cherisium, High Oracle Regant, had announced a revelation from the will decreeing that the outward observances of wearing the shroud and a commiserating countenance were no longer necessary. Blasphemy. Such revelations were contradictory to established doctrine. Alanya had cited the High Oracle's words, but that only led to a heated argument that lasted nearly the entire ride through the city. "I can't believe this," Alanya said, stepping away from Scovis. "I shouldn't have insisted that you come." She walked straight back, her head held high. Scovis knew she was trying to hide her displeasure. Alanya brushed back that loose strand of hair, tucking it beneath the braid wrapped around her head. Then she fidgeted at the hairpins arrayed throughout the braid, each inlaid with tiny sapphires. This was a mistake, Alanya shook her head, and then quickened her gait, her heels clicking loudly against the cobblestones. "Alanya!" Scovis called, but his wife did not stop. Her footsteps faded as she rounded a bend in the path. "You obstinate woman!" Alanya's footsteps completely faded, drowned out by the chorus of insects and the faint chatter of conversation coming from the deeper parts of the gardens. A pang of loneliness struck Scovis's heart. He stopped on the cobblestone path to regain his composure. "If only you were a devout, Alanya." Scovis closed his eyes, recalling a verse from the Feast of Sorrows, "Sorrow shall they wear upon their faces and remember my suffering." Those lines evoked misery in Scovis's heart, the proper emotions one should embrace in remembrance of God. That verse contradicted the High Oracle's revelation about the shroud. That was proof enough for Scovis that the will had not instructed Regant. Scovis struggled to retain a commiserating demeanor as he neared the large green behind Hawkover's mansion. The chatter of irreverent conversation grew louder with each footstep, causing the sorrow in Scovis's heart to turn to anger. How dare they be jovial? He thought, rounding a raised reflecting pool. The mansion's green was large enough to fit 3 dozen round tables, each capable of seating 14. The tables, decorated to near gaudiness, were occupied by members of Mindolarn's aristocracy. Scovis even recognized several members of the royal family among the crowd. But no one wore the shroud of devotion. Scovis gasped. Sacrilege. He shook his head, disgusted. Laughter burst from a nearby table, followed by raucous snorting. Dismayed, Scovis scanned the green. Was he the only one wearing the shroud? Since the High Oracle had announced the change, fewer and fewer devouts wore the shroud in public. During the last Feast of Sorrows only the royals and a few affluent foreigners from across the world had worn the shroud. What have we become? Scovis groaned inwardly. He caught sight of Alanya approaching, a tall but well-proportioned woman in a scarlet ball gown, one of the princesses, Radina Midivar, daughter of Emperor Mentas. Of all people, Scovis expected her to wear the shroud, but Radina's black hair had only ornaments in it. An involuntary grunt left Scovis's lips. What manner of apostasy is this? Was he the only devout showing his commiseration? The loneliness in his heart grew like a chasm widening amid a tumultuous earthquake. Laughter and clapping carried through the air, and Scovis turned to a nearby table. Those at the table, an assortment of men and women of varying ages, were rowdily conversing. The younger couples guzzled their dark orange drinks, an alcohol of some kind, then erupted in mirth. Drunkenness was something a devout was to avoid in preparation for the Feast of Sorrows. No, these fools couldn't be devouts. You imbeciles, Scovis said through clenched teeth, and those at the table spun to face him. Excuse me, a balding man said. Scovis knew of the man but couldn't recall his name. He was a minor duke who ruled a duchy near Leyland Lake, near the northeast borders of the Mindolarn Empire. Who are you calling an imbecile? Scovis shot a fierce glance to the duke. You of all people should be setting the proper example. The balding duke's eyes flared with anger, and he looked as if he were biting his tongue. A young lady beside the balding duke studied Scovis with drunken eyes. Why are you wearing lace? She slurred. Scovis started. Lace? The young lady, who was probably the duke's daughter, pointed to the shroud, her finger wobbling. Is that some dying fad? Why would a man ever want to wear lace? Laughter erupted from those at the table, except the duke. This is not lace, Scovis said, his tone strained. This is the shroud of devotion, the outward symbol worn by the true followers of our Lord. The young lady parted her lips, her eyes narrowing in confusion. Had she not been taught about the shroud? The corrupted decree by High Oracle Regant had come only 3 years ago. Perhaps she had never been taught such observances. Or was she just too drunk? You all are apostates, Scovis spat. Fools led by a fool. You make a mockery of our God with irreverent conversation and raucous laughter. Apostates, the balding duke blurted, rising from his chair. Fools. He wobbled as he approached Scovis. Who are you to judge our devotion? A true devout of Chezareth. Scovis shouted. You fools have twisted our manner of worship. The irreverent chatter died. The chirping insects were the only sounds on the green. Those at nearby tables turned to face Scovis while aristocrats across the green rose from their seats. Holding this celebration at this time is a mockery, Scovis declared, turning away from the imbecilic duke. Now that he had everyone's attention, he might as well make his point. Tonight is the second evening of the days of commiseration. Every one of you should be wearing the shroud of devotion, conversing in hushed tones of matters that would deepen your anguish for the loss of our God. Light murmurs rippled across the green. You violate tenets which have stood for ages. Drunkenness, Scovis snatched the wine glass in the balding duke's hand and threw it at the table. The noise of shattering glass filled the green, drawing gasps and alarmed expressions, is but one violation. All but Alanya looked surprised. Don't you see what you've become? You are no better than the heathens who know not our Lord. The balding duke tackled Scovis, interrupting him. Scovis fell to the manicured lawn, the duke astraddled him. An angered cry left the duke's lips as he reared, fists held above his head. Scovis raised his hands to block and continued shouting. This verifies the duke's fists crashed against Scovis's right forearm. Scovis gasped, sharp pains shooting toward his wrist and elbow. The duke reared again as several men and women rushed to the scuffle. Before the balding duke could strike again, he was hauled away, screaming and thrashing. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Scovis propped himself up on his uninjured arm. Are you so blinded that you can't see your degeneracy? It's no wonder our empire's dominion has dwindled. Hurried footfalls and clanking plate armor carried into the quiet green. The men and women around Scovis glared at him, though their mutters were not as vehement as the balding duke's. Scovis's name was shouted from deep within the crowd, but Scovis didn't recognize the voice. The footfalls and clanking metal grew louder as men in blood-red armor filed through the green, crimson Praetorians. Great! Scovis groaned. He pushed himself up as the Praetorians neared. You have all fallen. Scovis shouted. Turn from your corruption and embrace. Scovis Tasivir, the same voice shouted. Though Scovis did not recognize the voice, he knew the man when he saw him, High Oracle Regant. Regant, a tall and lanky man, marched across the green. His red robe bore the 7 emblems of Cherisium, embroidered in 2 columns near the shoulders, with each symbol repeated 3 times from the neckline to the skirts. You will cease your evil speaking at once, the High Oracle shouted. The patrons of the party turned toward the High Oracle. Some looked wary, others looked intrigued, but each expressed some degree of anticipation. No! Scovis cried. Someone must declare your heresy. A half-dozen crimson Praetorians reached Scovis, each leveling the bladed ends of their phanisars, a staved weapon with spiked balls on one end and a curved blade at the other. Heresy. Regant laughed. I am the High Oracle of Cherisium. I received the will of Cesareth, and through our Lord's divers manifestations I have directed his devoutes. It is you, Scovis, who are apostate. Scovis swallowed hard and winced at the pain in his arm. Was it broken? He had not felt nor heard a crack. You are trapped in archaic ways, Regant said, nearing the Praetorians. Ways that have been revealed to be wrong. He pointed to the shroud. Toss that to the ground, and I will forget your railings against me. Never. Regant's disregard for the shroud only strengthened Scovis's conviction that the High Oracle had corrupted Cherisium. Then I will not forgive you, Regant said, sighing. I'll see to it that your name is stricken from the temple of the Father. Scovis started. Excommunication. You bastard. Scovis growled. How dare you? Regant turned and waved his hand in a dismissal. Remove him. He is no longer welcome. The crimson Praetorians gestured with their weapons, pointing back the way Scovis had come. Good riddance, the balding duke shouted, still held back by the other aristocrats. Others exclaimed their own insults, but Scovis ignored them. He eyed his wife, who still stood with the princess. Alanya was turned away, her jaw set, obviously embarrassed by his outcry. It had to be done, Scovis thought. I couldn't live with this frustration bottled up. A man wearing a black servant's garb walked behind Alanya, his shoulders covered in diaphanous red silk. Scovis started. Someone else is wearing the shroud? The servant wove around the tables, moving across the green. He was a tall man, slender like Scovis. The servant's olive-skinned face was hawk-like, his gray hair short-cropped. He also had a gray goatee and mustache, both neatly trimmed. Scovis leaned forward, following the man with his eyes. The tip of a phanisar pierced Scovis's shirt and pricked his skin, but he was too intrigued to care. The servant was wearing the shroud of devotion. And his demeanor was solemn. A true devout. Scovis mused. I have to speak with him. A Praetorian waved his phanisar at Scovis as the servant climbed a wide set of red stone stairs leading to the upper terrace of Hawkover's mansion. Move, the Praetorian barked. Scovis ignored the fellow, his eyes still on the pious servant. Surely that man heard me. If he wears the shroud, perhaps he feels the same as I. I said move. Taking one step back, Scovis said, take me to the manor house. He lifted his injured arm. I would like to have it looked at before I leave. True, he wanted his arm examined, but perhaps he could delay his expulsion from the mansion and learn of the servant's identity. Surely they will listen if there is more than one of us still devout to the true ways of our religion. The Praetorians exchanged silent gazes. If you do not permit it, I will lodge a complaint. Fine, a Praetorian interrupted. Now move. Scovis gritted his teeth as the surgeon of Hawkover's mansion examined his injured arm. He sat on a stool with the surgeon looming over him. The surgeon pushed and pulled while asking questions to gauge Scovis's pain. Well, it seems you have some sort of a fracture, Your Excellency, the surgeon said. He glanced to the Praetorians standing at the door to his small room. Did one of them do this? No, Scovis said, studying the surgeon. He did not wear the shroud either. Best not to tell him the details. Well, I suggest you find an arpranist, the surgeon said, and moved to a wall of cabinets. You can let it heal on its own, since it doesn't seem too severe. But I can't know for certain. If we lived in the days of our forefathers we would able to know for sure. Their Tefisrals could tell such things. Scovis nodded. 1,000 years ago, Tefisrals, devices capable of manifesting magic, were abundant, but now they were scarce. Tefisrals had been outlawed by the rebels who overthrew the Karthar Empire, the last great nation to rule the world. The royal family of the Mindolarn Empire claimed a direct lineage to the rulers of Karthar, but their ancestral line actually fell short several generations. Tell me, Scovis said, wincing, do you know all the servants at this mansion? I'm looking for one man in particular. I know many, the surgeon said, turning from the cabinets with a sling in hand. Was it a servant who did this to you? No, I have other matters to discuss with him, religious matters. Scovis paused as the surgeon put the sling around his neck. He's a tall man, slender and graying. He wears a goatee and has a hawk's face. I can't recall anyone of that description, the surgeon said, easing Scovis's arm into the sling. I haven't seen any servants wearing a goatee in several years. Acres had one once, but he wore it for only a short while. This man's complexion was olive, Scovis said, like a Cerothian. I'm not aware of any servants of Cerothian descent. There, you're free to go, Your Excellency. Scovis looked at the sling, then glanced to the Praetorians. Thank you, he said and rose from his stool. Now how am I going to find him? Scovis wondered, sauntering toward the door. He did not dare attempt to escape from the Crimson Praetorians. Running from them would be futile. They were the most skilled warriors in the Empire, and most Crimson Praetorians specialized in wielding some form of magic. The Praetorians stepped away from the door as Scovis approached them. 4 of them boxed Scovis between them while the other 2 moved a few paces down the hall. They marched through the mansion while Scovis considered his dilemma. I could ask them if they know him, he thought. They rounded a corner, entering a hallway lining the mansion's 3-story ballroom. The tantalizing aromas of baked Cyrenian and other coastal fish cooked with tangy spices filled the hall. Servants hurried about, carrying platters of food toward the open doors leading to the upper terrace. The irreverent chatter of those imbeciles carried through the doors, but it was faint. The Praetorians behind Scovis lowered their fanissars, creating a barrier between them and their fellows. Scovis grunted and shook his head. I have no desire to return to those fools, he spat. As they turned down another hallway, a tall figure wearing black and red whipped around the corner of a nearby corridor. Was that him? Scovis wondered. He quickened his pace, but a gauntlet hand pulled him back. Do not try to escape, a Praetorian said. Scovis tried to shake the man's hand loose, but the grip was firm. They neared the corridor and Scovis peered down it. The servant wearing the shroud was striding down the hall. Wait! Scovis called, abruptly halting. But the Praetorian pushed him forward. Scovis barely glimpsed the pious servant turning down a corridor to his right. One of the Praetorians in the lead turned, raising his hand. Don't make this harder than necessary, he said. I will enthrall you if need be. Scovis pursed his lips. He had to find that servant. Please, wait. The Praetorians continued marching, those in the rear pushing Scovis. Surely you heard me in the surgeon, Scovis said. I must find that servant. Our orders were clear, said a Praetorian behind Scovis. Scovis sighed. There had to be a way to persuade them. I can pay you, he blurted. Was that wise? He chided himself. Praetorians were stalwart and incorruptible, weren't they? The two Praetorians immediately ahead of Scovis looked at each other, then glanced to those in the rear. How much? Asked the one ahead and to the left. Scovis raised an eyebrow. Was the Praetorian actually considering a bribe? Don't be greedy, Rovar, said the Praetorian pushing Scovis. Rovar stopped, causing the others to halt. Surely we can both obey our orders and earn some coin, Rovar said, looking at the Praetorian beside him. Don't you agree, Greeds? Greeds shrugged. For the right price. I can't believe you too, said the Praetorian prodding Scovis. Hear me out, Sicilian, Rovar said. The High Oracle ordered us to escort him from the banquet, which we have. As long as we don't go near the gardens or the upper terrace, we can obey and profit from this incident. That's quite the reasoning, said a Praetorian in the lead. Now let's hear what the High Duke has to offer. He sounded more amused than interested. Scovis sucked in a deep breath before answering. The Crimson Praetorians were treated well by the Empire. Many had lavish homes in the capital, and if they had families they were well cared for. I can't skimp on this, he thought. Scovis considered the wealth of House Tasivir. Could he relinquish those possessions for a mere conversation that might lead to nothing? But then again it could spark a reformation of Cherisium. And that was worth more than all the wealth in the world. Well, High Duke? Rovar asked. What is your offer? Scovis hesitated, taking a deep breath. Lands in Travadia, and titles. Well, Greed said, chuckling. Rovar nodded. I like that. What do the rest of you think? All but Sicilian voiced their agreement. This is foolish, Sicilian spat, tightening his grip. If you will not escort him, then. There are 5 of us, Rovar interrupted, and 1 of you. He gestured to the Praetorian beside Sicilian. Soroka can simply open a portal and hurl you into the Vizurm expanse. Scovis was jerked backward, pulled by Sicilian. Then you will. Scovis felt Sicilian's grip no longer as a crash resounded behind him. Surprised mutters came from each Praetorian as Scovis turned. Sicilian lay on the ground, limp. Had the man been struck down somehow? None of the Praetorians had uttered an incantation. Perhaps a sign from God. Scovis thought. Soroka knelt beside the limp Praetorian and lifted his visor. He held the bladed edge of his fanisar at Sicilian's open mouth. That was a common tactic used to scour a battlefield for survivors. He's not breathing, Soroka said. Scovis eyed the blade. It showed no signs of the fog that normally appeared when someone breathed on polished metal. As Soroka rose from the ground, Scovis caught a whiff of a sweet metallic scent. Soroka started and spun back to Sicilian. Does anyone else smell blood? Rovar muttered. Soroka knelt once again beside Sicilian, studying the Praetorian's armor. I don't see any signs of penetration. 2 Praetorians brushed past Scovis, kneeling beside Sicilian. They grunted as they helped heave the man onto his side. His armor is intact, one of the Praetorians said. But, damn, he is heavy. He's definitely dead then, Soroka said, studying the back plates. They eased Sicilian's corpse back onto the floor. Well, we can't leave him here, Rovar said. Someone should lift him. As the 3 Praetorians stepped away, blood dripped from Sicilian's mouth. Gasps filled the hallway. How is that possible? Blurted Greeds. He's bleeding as if he had been stabbed, another Praetorian said. Scovis raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He had heard tales of men and women collapsing and found with fatal wounds that had simply appeared. Their wounds were often caused by some sort of blade, but their clothing, or armor, showed no signs of fraying or puncturing. In an obscure book of scripture, such incidents were referred to as bleeding without wounds, and only the faithful or those deemed worthy by God survived such an event. You were struck down for your defiance, Scovis thought, eyeing the corpse. My cause is righteous. One of the Praetorians who had aided Soroka turned to Scovis, his face pale. I will help you, Your Excellency. The man probably realized what had happened. Soroka nodded. Rovar cleared his throat. Well, someone lift him. We don't want anyone to stumble across a corpse, especially a Crimson Praetorian. And then what do we do with him? Soroka asked. We can discuss that later, Rovar said. Now let's help the High Duke find this servant. Rovar and Greeds led Scovis back to the corridor where he had last seen the servant. Vavid, one of the Praetorians who had been in the lead, carried Sicalian's corpse with a mass of green tentacles. He went down that hall, Scovis said, pointing to a corridor on the right near the far end. They turned down the hall, which bent to the left after a short distance. After rounding the second bend, Scovis started. The servant with the shroud was partway down the hall, walking away from Scovis and the Praetorians. Had the man stopped for some reason? Wait! Scovis called, but the servant didn't respond. The hawk-faced man turned another corner, not even glancing back. Scovis bolted down the hall. He winced as his arm bounced in the sling, sharp pain racing along his forearm. Clanking armor echoed off the stone walls as the Praetorians matched Scovis's sprint. Scovis gritted his teeth and darted around the corner but stopped abruptly. A short hall led to a pair of double doors, both pulled shut. He must have gone in there, Rovar said. Scovis nodded and grunted. He hadn't heard the doors open or close. Probably drowned out by the clanking armor, he thought. Rovar stepped ahead of Scovis and opened the right door, revealing a two-story library brightly lit by an elegant chandelier filled with lightstones. Plush scarlet furniture, oversized chairs and sofas, filled the center of the space while bookshelves lined the walls. The only window in the room was within a dormer above the upper shelves. At the far end, behind an ornate desk made of polished red stone, stood the servant with his hand on a shoulder-height shelf. As Scovis entered the library, the servant turned, a wry smile spreading across his face. That took you long enough, the servant said, his voice deep and stern. What? Scovis asked, crossing the library. His forearm throbbed with each step. Scovis wove around an oversized armchair, his boots clicking with each step. The Praetorians, however, remained at the door. I've been expecting you, the servant said. Scovis furrowed his brow, confused. Expecting me? Who was this servant? Your tirade on the green was commendable, the servant said, still looking amused. The children of the promise have strayed from the ancient ways. I doubt many even speak the token, or the vow. Do you speak them? Scovis nodded. Choke, Suzak, choke, he paused, taking in a deep breath. May the crimson eye remain hidden for all time. Very good, the words oozed from the servant's mouth. Then there is hope for you yet. So you feel the same as I, Scovis observed, stopping at the desk. Something must be done to expunge the heresy introduced to Cherisium. If the two of us work together, perhaps we can start a movement that will cleanse our doctrine. Your fervor is admirable, the servant said. But the time for reformation is long past. Scovis started. Don't look baffled, the servant continued. A new era is coming. The Unspoken One shall awaken. He will cleanse the brethren and cast out the heresy brought on by the absence of the chosen. The Unspoken One? Scovis asked and set his jaw. It was an obscure title, one that few devots would recognize. Scovis had only come across it twice in all his studies of Cherisium. The Unspoken One was another name for the prophesied forerunner ordained to pave the way for God's second advent. Your God has a task for you to perform, the servant said. Your God? Scovis wondered. Wasn't this servant a devout, too? But his manner of speech was too informal. And wouldn't a servant reference Scovis's title? A task that will prove your devotion and prepare a way for Cherisium's cleansing, the servant said. No longer will the erroneous beliefs introduced by men like Regant blind the faithful. Come. The servant lifted his hand from the shelf, pointing to a dark blue hardbound book. From where he stood, Scovis couldn't read the book's embossed title. He turned to the servant and studied him. Who was this man? Was he a prophet of some kind? Or something else? Don't be shy, the servant said. Come, Scovis Tasivir. Scovis pursed his lips. He had not introduced himself, but perhaps the man had heard Regant. That must be it, Scovis thought and stepped around the desk. He stopped in front of the shelf where the servant's hand pointed to the book's title, Dreamwalker. Take it, the servant said, pulling his hand away. You want me to steal this? Scovis asked incredulously. The servant grinned. This text doesn't belong here, he said. It was stolen from a master of dreams. Besides, this volume was destined to come into your possession. A master of dreams? Scovis wondered. What or who was that? Scovis hesitated. And what am I supposed to do with this? How is a book going to help cleanse corruption? A wide smile spread across the servant's face. Do not underestimate the power of small and simple things, Scovis. Possessing this book is by far the most important thing you will ever do. Scovis raised an eyebrow at the servant. But we should do something more. Surely there are others that believe as you and I. We can rally them. The servant snickered. His laughter grew, sounding more diabolical than mirthful. If you want to do more, take this book and apply its teachings. Then we can talk about further actions once you reach the translucent fields. Scovis started. The translucent fields, he muttered, furrowing his brow. The translucent fields was another name for Va-Benach, the divine realm of God. Only the most penitent of the faithful were permitted to dwell there. Who are you? He asked the servant. The servant, however, didn't answer. Leave, Scovis Tasivir, and take that book with you, lest you doom your God. In that instant the servant vanished. His disappearance was not like the veiling of invisibility magic or the whisking of a conjurer's portal. He simply disappeared. Gasps filled the library. Scovis blinked in disbelief. What had happened? The servant wasn't a delusion, was he? No, the Praetorians had seen him too. He couldn't be a manifestation of the will, could he? Scovis wondered. Who was that man? Suroka asked. That was no man, Vavid said, his voice trembling. Of the 5 Praetorians he seemed the most devout. He was a holy messenger, like the messenger of the promise. Rovar snorted. He can't be the messenger of the promise, Scovis thought. Only the prophets of the Triffica, the chosen of Chesrith, were privileged such manifestations. The words of an obscure passage of scripture came to Scovis's mind, he shall come to the faithful, clothed in red. The messenger of the promise shall speak for God, manifesting the will of the Father even after the chosen forsake the world because of boundless iniquity. Scovis's heart sank as he realized that verse had been fulfilled. Wary, Scovis pulled the dark blue book from the shelf. The Praetorians continued to debate the servant's identity, but Scovis ignored their speculation. Dreamwalker was thin compared to other volumes in the library. Its pages were sleek, made from an indestructible material. Books constructed in such a manner were beyond rare. Rumor claimed such books were left over from the days of the Carther Empire. Do I dare take this? Scovis wondered. That decision hinged upon the servant's identity. If he were a holy messenger, then his words were true. If not, then Scovis would be considered a thief. Doom God, or face the consequences of theft. He considered the two options for only a moment. Any fines would be a pittance, and he easily could buy his way out of serving any jail time. "You're coming with me," Scovis whispered to Dreamwalker and rounded the desk. He struggled to peruse the book with one hand. There has to be a better way to read this, he thought, and positioned Dreamwalker awkwardly between the sling and his chest. The pressure caused a dull ache that radiated through his entire forearm, but the pain did not quash his curiosity. Scovis flipped through the pages as he approached the Praetorians. His eyes were drawn to a passage toward the end of the book. "I said earlier that accessing Vabenok was for God and his chosen. That is in part true. They can access it at will. But I have walked the translucent fields myself and beheld the wonders of that realm. I have taught others my discoveries, and they have joined me in that supernal world. Here, in this final chapter, I will show you what you must do." Scovis's lips parted and his eyes widened. Walk the translucent fields? But how was that possible? The living were not supposed to do such a thing. "You really believe that?" Rovar asked. "Of course," Vavid said, raising a gauntlet fist. "We must aid the High Duke, otherwise we will end up like poor Sicalian." The Praetorians ceased their debate as Scovis came within arm's reach. "We'll escort you home, Your Excellency," Vavid said. "The task before you is surely divine. And no payment is necessary." "Speak for yourself," Rovar said. "I still expect those lands and that title you promised." "You'll have them," Scovis said, glancing to Dreamwalker. Whatever this book was, it was surely important. But why? Before leaving the library of Hawkover's mansion, the Praetorians devised a plan to both fulfill their orders from the High Oracle and aid Scovis. The visitation from the messenger had motivated them in ways Scovis had not expected. Vavid took the lead in the plotting, and Scovis assumed he was the leader of the small squad. Amid their planning, Rovar had used his magic to recreate Sicalian, a complex illusion of some sort that actually looked and acted lifelike. Once Rovar had finished, Soroka opened a conjuration portal and placed Sicalian's corpse within a timeless void called the Vizurm Expanse. As with the other aspects of magic, Scovis didn't know much about that place. The Praetorians' plan consisted of leaving Soroka and Valadin behind to report Scovis's departure to Regant. They were to tell the High Oracle that Vavid, Rovar, Greeds, and Sicalian escorted Scovis back to his mansion. The march through the city of Mindolarn took several hours. In that time Scovis struggled to read Dreamwalker. Though the streets were well lit, his injured arm made it difficult to read while walking. Between the pain and dropping the book, Scovis had to pause many times and reread several passages. But from what he had read, the content of the volume was quite intriguing. Amid their march, Rovar had suggested they simply enhance themselves and Scovis so they could bound across the city. Praetorians dashing faster than horses was not an uncommon sight. But Vavid refuted the suggestion. "We must maintain our ruse," Vavid had told Rovar, explaining that any deviation could ruin their plan and result in their discharge from the Crimson Praetorians. Rovar didn't seem to care the least bit, the man seemed content retiring to Travadia. Besides, running would have only made Scovis's injury that much worse, and none of the Praetorians were versed in using Arpran magic. Scovis was halfway through Dreamwalker when he and the Praetorians approached the gates of the Tasivir mansion. Two men stood outside the wrought iron gates, each clad in red and brown leather armor. They drew their side swords upon seeing Scovis, their blades singing through the air. The guard on the left, a well-built man named Petrol, stepped forward, ready to engage the Praetorians. "Your Excellency!" Petrol called, his gaze shooting to the sling cradling Scovis's injured arm. "It's fine," Scovis said, pushing past the Praetorians. "Stand down, Petrol. Where is your carriage?" Petrol demanded, sheathing his sword. "And where is the High Duchess?" "I left early," Scovis said. He turned to the Praetorians. Only Rovar and Vavid were close. Greeds and the illusion of Sicalian had kept their distance from the gate. "Thank you for your assistance, Praetorians." Rovar and Vavid nodded, then walked away. Prior to leaving Hawkover's mansion, Scovis agreed to meet with the Praetorians after the Feast of Sorrows and deliver the deeds to the lands he promised them. Scovis tucked Dreamwalker under his arm and proceeded toward the gates of his mansion. "What happened, Your Excellency?" Petrel asked. Scovis shook his head and grunted. "I was accosted for calling a man to repentance," he said. Petrel pursed his lips, then glanced over his shoulder. The Praetorians' armored footfalls faded as Scovis and Petrel reached the gate. "And they escorted you from the party?" Petrel asked. "It's more complicated than that," Scovis said. Petrel nodded and reached for the gate. "Why don't you send for an arpranist?" Scovis said to the guard. "I have some reading to do, and I would very much like to be able to study comfortably." "As you wish, Your Excellency." Once the gate was opened, Scovis strode down the stone walkway leading to the mansion's two-story portico. Petrel's hurried footfalls faded to the left, toward the stables. Scovis was not even halfway to the portico when the two-story doors swung open and Hazais, the butler of Tasivir mansion, dashed outside. "Your Excellency!" Hazais called. "Your Excellency, what happened?" The dark orange tails of Hazais's coat and its decorative white tassels fluttered as the butler ran through the portico and down a short flight of stairs. Scovis didn't reply. That answer was not something he wanted to shout. Though the grounds of his mansion here in the capital were large, shouting could still be heard by the neighboring estates. Hazais huffed and puffed as he neared Scovis. The short man stumbled to a halt and braced his hands upon his knees. He looked to the sling, shaking his head. "Petrel is already fetching an arpranist," Scovis said. "How were you injured, Your Excellency?" Hazais asked between breaths. "An imbecile attacked me," Scovis chuckled, "over a dispute about doctrine." Hazais pursed his lips in an exaggerated fashion. The butler had overheard the argument between Scovis and Alanya prior to the banquet. Hazais had worn the shroud of devotion for many years, but had recently decided to forego the practice. In fact, none of Scovis's servants wore the shroud. Scovis had considered forcing them, but he knew Alanya would never stand for such an order. Besides, he hadn't compelled her over the years. Scovis and Hazais walked in silence until they reached the mansion's towering doors. "Fetch me a lectern," Scovis said. "I will read in the parlor while I wait for an arpranist." "As you wish, Your Excellency," Hazais said with a bow and hurried into the mansion. Scovis sauntered through the portico and removed Dreamwalker from under his arm. "It's time to unravel your secrets," he thought, smiling. He would learn to walk the translucent fields, if it was the last thing he would ever do. Scovis sat back in a plush, high-backed chair as a faint buzz carried through the air. Green light, arpran magic, wove around the sling holding Scovis's injured forearm. A strange sensation, like the pricking of 100 needles, surged through his bones. The arpranist that Petrel had fetched continued muttering her incantation, causing more of the green magic to flow from her hands. Scovis took in a deep breath and focused on the lectern holding Dreamwalker. An audible breath left his lips as he continued reading. "Now if those techniques do not provide you with sufficient lucidity, then I suggest you try another method. There is an elixir one can make that prepares one's mind." Scovis winced at the sharp pain shooting through his forearm. He felt the bone straighten, and then the pain was gone. "There you are," the arpranist said, her voice high and nasal. "Thank you," Scovis said. "My butler will pay you for your services." The arpranist nodded and left the parlor, her booted feet making barely any noise. Scovis flexed his fingers and continued reading. "You will need the following ingredients: halicim, ganyard, wevid, glossary, the juice of brandleberries, sugar, and powdered rogulin. Taken aback, Scovis muttered, "Powdered rogulin?" That seemed like the oddest ingredient, but rogulin was used in the teleportation spells cast by conjurers. Perhaps it is a necessary component to enable travel to the translucent fields. But where was he going to find powdered rogulin? Scovis set his jaw while his eyes and the arpranist spoke in the foyer. A faint jingling carried into the parlor as his eyes opened a coin purse. The butler carefully set one coin at a time in the arpranist's hand. I wonder if she knows of a conjurer willing to sell his crystals. Most conjurers coveted their rogulin crystals, exchanging them with other conjurers for the use of swift travel across the world. Scovis didn't quite understand how it worked, but if one conjurer possessed a rogulin crystal from another conjurer, the first could travel to the second instantly. His eyes finished paying the mage as Scovis reached the foyer. "Excuse me," Scovis said, drawing the attention of both butler and mage. "But do you know any conjurers?" The arpranist furrowed her brow. "Why would you need a conjurer, Your Excellency?" "I'm looking to purchase some rogulin," Scovis said. "Bound or unbound?" the arpranist asked. Scovis hadn't the slightest clue as to what that meant. "It doesn't matter," Scovis replied. The arpranist nodded. "My brother is a conjurer. If he is able to help, I'll ask him to pay you a visit." "Thank you," Scovis said, nodding in thanks. As the arpranist walked across the foyer, the doors opened and Alanya strode into the mansion, her crimson ball gown trailing behind her. The High Duchess glanced to the arpranist, but then settled a fierce gaze on Scovis. Alanya stopped 3 paces from the doors, pursing her lips and planting her hands on her hips. No woman had ever looked so displeased. Scovis stared at his wife, bracing himself for the storm dammed behind her silent fury. His eyes undoubtedly sensed the tension and hurried out of the foyer. Once the doors creaked shut, the dam broke. "I can't believe you!" Alanya shouted, shaking her head. "What was that?" Before Scovis could answer, she railed at him with more questions. "What on Kalda could have possessed you to shout such heinous things? Do you not care for our family's reputation? How will Travadia fare after your outburst?" "Alanya, please hear me out." Scovis's plea was trampled by more accusing questions. "What will people think of us now? Were you even considering me when you lost your temper? Did you even pause to think of how your outburst affected me?" Tears welled in Alanya's eyes, and the fury in her features melted into sorrow. Her questions ceased but were replaced by sobbing. Regret filled Scovis's heart. He had simply reacted, not thinking at all. "I'm sorry, Alanya." He stepped forward, reaching out to comfort her, but Alanya pulled back. "No," she muttered, still sobbing. Her lips quivered as she stared at Scovis, tears clouding her emerald eyes. The lines in her face became more pronounced, catching tears as they trickled down her face. "Just let me be." Scovis's heart sank as Alanya pushed past him. Her heels clicked through the foyer and around the corner. "Oh, Alanya," Scovis whispered. He stood in the foyer until his wife's footsteps faded into the upper floors of the mansion. If only she understood, he thought, entering the parlor. Scovis returned to his seat and grabbed Dreamwalker. He wouldn't need the lectern anymore, now that his arm had healed. With the book in hand, Scovis scanned the open page, resuming where he had left off. There was more to entering the translucent fields than simply drinking the elixir, he discovered. According to the author of Dreamwalker, a man or woman who remained anonymous throughout the entire text, one's mind had to be prepared to enter a state of lucidity. Luckily for Scovis, he had dabbled in controlling one's dreams. After Scovis finished reading Dreamwalker, he retired to one of the guest rooms. Alanya most assuredly did not want to share a bed with him tonight. Sleep overcame Scovis quickly. Strange dreams filled his mind, nightmares really. Prior to sleeping, Scovis had envisioned a woman in a white dress and had told himself repeatedly that when he saw her he would take control of his dream. Scene after scene played in his dreams until he found a woman standing on a cliff overlooking a sea of black sand. Her white dress stood out brilliantly against the abysmal backdrop. Scovis gasped as he became lucid. The dizzying height of the cliffs was all too real. He wobbled as wind howled up the cliffs. Steadying himself, Scovis focused on the woman. She was teetering on the precipice. Form the first emblem, he commanded while focusing on the white dress. The instructions in Dreamwalker said that the first emblem of Cherisium must be engraved into whatever object brought one into lucidity. Golden thread wove the first emblem into the woman's dress, the threads first formed the upright sword and its jagged fuller. The 6 curved spikes were woven next, each protruding from near the sword's pommel. And lastly the 8-sided stars were woven above each spike. The woman, however, seemed completely oblivious to the transformation. Alza choke as nira, Scovis said. The woman inclined her head toward him, looking confused. Was that not it? Scovis wondered. Had he said the words incorrectly? Speaking those words should open a doorway to Vabenok. Perhaps I missed something. The cliff top shook and Scovis fell and a deafening scream pierced the air. Scovis pushed himself up just as the woman in white fell backward and tipped over the precipice. No! Scovis shouted, scrambling to the falling woman. The woman screamed as Scovis tried to grab her, but they were too far apart. Her horrified wails faded as she plummeted to the sea of black sand. Soon, only the howling wind remained. Damn it! Scovis shouted. He struggled to regain his footing and wobbled on the precipice. I don't suggest following her, Scovis knew that voice. Intrigued, he spun around. The servant from Hawkover's mansion stood on the cliff dressed in his black garb with the shroud of devotion over his shoulders. You! Scovis cried, but the ground gave way before him. Wind rushed all around him and he tumbled through the air, his stomach knotting. He caught brief flashes of the cliff top and that servant. Was the man smiling? Stop falling! Scovis commanded as he flipped in the air, but he kept plummeting toward the black sand. The ground raced toward him and blackness veiled his vision. Scovis gasped, violently sitting upright. He blinked several times and found himself once again in the guest chamber. The muffled sound of singing birds carried into the room while sunlight shone through the western windows. That should have worked, Scovis said, rubbing his forehead. A rapping came from the door, then his eyes entered. Your Excellency, Master Oberus Valaris is here to see you. Scovis narrowed his eyes in confusion. He is the brother of the Arpranist who healed you last night. Ah, yes, Scovis said. I will be right down to see him. Scovis left the bedchamber wearing pale gray silk pajamas and, of course, the shroud of devotion. Dreamwalker was tucked beneath his arm with the spine facing the floor. Scovis found the conjurer waiting in the foyer with a blank expression on his face. If the man were wearing the shroud, Scovis would have considered him a true devout. But alas, Oberus Valaris only wore the golden robes of his magical discipline. Good morning, Your Excellency. Master Oberus bowed. I hear you are in need of Rogulan. Do you need any bound to a specific location? No, Scovis said, striding toward the man. Very well, Oberus said, reaching into his robe and removing 3 small pouches. Each pouch had a name embroidered on it, the names of various cities within the Mindolarn Empire. If you intend to rebind the crystal, I can sell you one from Ovolo. Scovis nodded. His eyes here will handle the payment. As you wish, Oberus said and reached into the pouch with the name Ovolo on it. The Rogulan crystal Oberus removed was no larger than a grape and glistened with flecks of gold. Here you are, Your Excellency. Thank you, Scovis said and grabbed the crystal. It was vaguely translucent. Now how to go about grinding you? He wondered. Scovis and the conjurer began discussing the cost. Scovis didn't care to listen and sauntered away, eyeing the gem. Odd how this crystal has dual purposes, he mused, meandering through the mansion. He made his way to the kitchens, near the mansion's rear. Eyes still on the gem, Scovis entered the sitting room adjoining the kitchens and halted in surprise. Alanya sat in a high-backed chair near a window, sipping from a steaming mug and reading a book, one of her romantic tales, no doubt. She simply glanced at Scovis. At least she's not scowling, Scovis thought and entered the kitchen. "Good morning, Your Excellency," Chef Ritar said, his tone cheery. "What would you like to eat this morning?" "Anything will do, Ritar," Scovis said and continued through the kitchen. The chef got to work as Scovis made his way to the storeroom off the kitchen. He slipped the Rogulan into the pocket of his pajama pants and flipped open Dreamwalker. Now what page was the elixir on, he mumbled to himself. Before long, Scovis found the ingredient list. The storeroom contained all the herbs, though the supply of halicin was almost depleted. "I hope we have enough," Scovis thought, juggling the 4 bottles of herbs. "Tell me, Ritar," Scovis called as he returned to the kitchen, "do we have any fresh brandleberries?" "I don't believe so, Your Excellency." Scovis sighed and set the bottles on a countertop. A skillet sizzled and the savory aroma of ground beef filled the kitchen. He glanced to Alanya, who was still engrossed by her book. Scovis stared at her for some time, but Alanya didn't seem to notice. "Perhaps I should stay in the guest house for a while," he thought. Scovis searched the kitchen for a basket and quickly deposited the ingredients for the elixir. Rovar was still preparing Scovis's meal. "I'll eat in the guest house solarium," Scovis called as he left the kitchen. Grinding the Rogulan crystal to a powder was a task that lasted well past nightfall. Scovis had spent the entire day in the guest house on the far side of Tasivir mansion. He hoped putting distance between him and Alanya would quell her anger. He put off brewing the elixir, as the instructions in Dreamwalker required 12 hours, and retired to one of the beds in the guest house. During his time grinding the Rogulan, he reread Dreamwalker and discovered he had done something wrong. The object that would bring him into lucidity needed to have the first emblem on it before he actually became lucid. So he spent the day repeatedly imagining white cloth bearing the emblem. That was a common exercise one used to train one's mind to achieve lucidity while dreaming. Scovis had also forgotten to form a doorway before speaking the words, "Alza choke esamez nira." Scovis drew up the bed covers and composed himself for sleep. Dreams soon came, but he struggled to achieve lucidity. The dreams were filled with the ominous cacophony of war. Soldiers were strewn across a war-torn battlefield, the basalt ground covered with the blood of the slain. Scovis eventually discovered a white war banner with the first emblem embroidered in black upon it. Lucidity, however, did not last long. Scovis awoke to his eyes shaking him. "Your Excellency," the butler cried, his voice shaky. "Oh. Your Excellency, I have dire news." The expression on Hazai's face was ominous. "Yes?" Scovis asked. An envelope bearing a crimson seal flapped in Hazai's shaky hand. Though Scovis couldn't see the sigil embossed on the seal, he knew who it was from. Regant. Scovis quickly sat upright. He snatched the envelope from Hazai's and tore it open. The letter was from Regant, and its contents were succinct. Scovis did not read past the sentence, "Your name has been stricken from the Temple of the Father." "I am so sorry, Your Excellency," Hazai said woefully. Scovis rose from the bed and stalked to the window, where the staccato melody of a Rasivalan, a blood-red bird, carried into the room. "They can excommunicate me," he said, snarling, "but they can't deprive me of my devotion." Scovis crumpled the letter and envelope and threw them to the ground. Scovis spent the rest of the day brewing the elixir. He struggled to maintain a commiserating countenance, but he did manage to restrain himself from unleashing his anger. The brewing elixir took on an awful stench as evening drew near. The odor was so potent that Scovis nearly emptied his stomach. How am I going to drink this? There wasn't much of the elixir, only enough for 1.5 servings as described in Dreamwalker. I might as well drink it all, Scovis muttered. The elixir was maroon-colored with glistening flecks in it, undoubtedly bits of the Rogulan crystal. Scovis filled a large cup and walked to the guesthouse's solarium. All was quiet in both the solarium and the mansion's rear yard. Alanya was tending to the flowers near the mansion's kitchen. That was the first he had seen of her. If she had known of Regant's letter it had not affected her. He harumphed and averted his gaze to the city's skyline above the trees of his mansion. He settled his gaze on the Mindolarn Palace, an enormous dome-shaped structure of reddish-brown stone that sat on a mound a half-hour's ride away. In 3 days, the Feast of Sorrows would be held there, on the banquet yard behind the palace. The elixir's putrid smell brought Scovis back to reality. Sighing heavily, he pressed the cup to his lips and quaffed the elixir. He was halfway through it when the world began to spin. Scovis staggered but continued drinking. He had to drink the elixir. His legs gave way, and he fell forward. Scovis landed on a manicured lawn. Magic erupted above him, the explosions pressing him against the blades of grass. Where am I? Scovis pushed himself up as screams resounded all around him. Men and women in the formal garbs of the Empire ran across the banquet yard of the Imperial Palace, the place where the Feast of Sorrows was held. Was this some twisted version of that blessed event? Scovis could taste blood in his mouth. More magic erupted around him, causing his ears to ring. The sensations were all too real. Am I already lucid? The question was answer enough. Everyone that was fleeing bore the first emblem, the women on their dresses and the men on their tailed coats. Tables, both upright and toppled, also bore the sacred emblem. There, Scovis whispered, eyeing a nearby table. He envisioned a circular doorway with 7 keystones bearing the inscribed characters of an ancient and long-forgotten language. The table shifted, like the magic from those trans-something or others, conforming to the image in Scovis's mind. Alza choke samaz nira, Scovis said. Yellow light surged from the keystones and into the center of the doorway. The light expanded, erupting in a brilliant flash that blinded Scovis. The clamor of armor, dying wails, and explosions filled the air as Scovis attempted to blink away his blindness. The cacophony of war grew louder as Scovis's vision returned. A sea of glass lay beyond the circular door, beneath a yellow sky. The translucent fields, Scovis rose to his feet and dashed to the doorway. I've done it. Once Scovis was a leap and bound away, something collided with him. He tumbled to the grassy ground, rolling sideways. An incantation left the lips of someone nearby while violet light reflected off the ground. Scovis spun, finding a battle-armored mage with his hands enveloped in a purple hue. Though Scovis was not well versed in the magical arts, he knew that violet magic was among the most deadly, capable of disintegrating whatever it touched. Depart! Scovis cried and the battle-armored mage vanished. This was his dream, after all. Scovis pushed himself from the ground and leapt through the doorway. The eruptions faded as Scovis landed on the glassy ground. He expected to land with a thud, but he bounced off the crystalline surface. Scovis staggered to his feet and turned back to the doorway. Men and women fell to the onslaught of magic. What a massacre, Scovis muttered and turned from the doorway. The sky above him was more brilliant than amber. And the sun, it was blue. Just like in The Calling of an Emperor, the painting that hung in the parlor of Tasivir mansion and symbolically depicted Emperor Mindolarn's divine appointment. The emperor and his brothers stood upon a sea of glass beneath an amber sky. A beam of blue shone from a sun, illuminating the emperor. But Scovis had never considered that painting to be literal. I'm truly here, Scovis marveled, stepping across the translucent ground. The translucent fields extended endlessly in all directions. Where should I go? He wondered, studying the sea of glass. Strange ripples flowed beneath the translucent ground. Is that? Scovis's eyes widened as he realized that the rippling was the shifting of a landscape, growing old and renewing. Incredible, he muttered and pressed deeper into the translucent fields. Why is no one else here? He asked aloud. If this were truly the realm of God, shouldn't it be filled with both the penitent and divine beings? Scovis set his jaw and spun about. The portal where he had entered was no longer visible. How far have I walked? As Scovis turned around, the translucent ground shook. The sea of glass groaned, and the crystal cracked in a jagged oval with Scovis at its heart. He yelped as the ground heaved upward. Scovis fell, the air pressing him downward. The translucent ground shifted in shape, becoming polished obsidian. The upheaval settled and Scovis warily rose to his feet. He was now standing on an obsidian plateau dozens of stories above the crystal plane he had traversed. Scovis blinked in disbelief, struggling to comprehend the how to the bizarre upheaval. Had he somehow created this plateau? Scovis had read in Dreamwalker that the translucent fields could be manipulated. No, I manifested it. Scovis spun and started upon seeing a man in a red robe lounging upon an elevated black throne. Impossible, Scovis muttered. The man looked identical to the servant Scovis had encountered in Hawkover's mansion, except his beard was full and his hair was longer, hanging to his shoulders. His eyes were a glistening sapphire and his hair was whiter than the driven snow. The throne was made of polished black stone, unlike the obsidian of the plateau, and was elevated 7 steps above Scovis. 7 curved spires protruded from behind the throne, each glistening varied hues. A steep triangular black shape ran from the foot of the throne to the base of the bottom step, the apex facing away from the throne. Well done, the robed man said, rising from the throne. But I would not expect anything less from a true devout of Cherisium. Scovis gasped. The stranger's robe bore the 7 emblems of Cherisium, each was finely detailed and embroidered with glowing crimson thread. Some parts of the symbols were woven with gold, not golden thread, but actual gold. Each of the 7 emblems was mirrored in perfect symmetry. Scovis had read plenty of texts describing that robe and to whom it belonged. The messenger of the promise. Scovis thought. That I am, Scovis Tasivir, the robed man, no, the messenger, said, descending the steps. Welcome to Vabenok. Scovis could not believe his eyes. Had the servant in Hawkover's mansion truly been the messenger of the promise? If so, his task had been of divine origin. Yes, it is I that came to you, the messenger said, stopping a pace away from Scovis. He shall walk among the faithful, and they will know him not, the messenger quoted a passage of scripture. Scovis sucked in his breath. He had believed that his task was divine but now he knew. You've done well to access Vabenok in such a short time. Not even the Masters of Dreams could enter this realm that swiftly. Masters of Dreams? Scovis asked, regaining his composure. The messenger nodded. A secret order of devoutes who learned how to walk the translucent fields several thousand years ago. They were thrust from Ikathrum for their heresy. It was their founder who wrote Dreamwalker. Scovis furrowed his brow, confused. What is Ikathrum? He wondered. The true name for the heart of the world, the messenger clarified. Had he read Scovis's mind? Surely you know of it. Scovis nodded. The heart of the world was the place where the goddess Cutharn had secreted her followers, the last remaining devoutes after the War of the Gods. Few people believed it actually existed, though. The messenger of the promise turned from Scovis. I have watched you closely these past few days, Scovis Tasivir. Despite your excommunication, you still adhere to the tenets of Cherisium. You've borne a woeful countenance and worn the shroud of devotion, you wear it even now. Scovis glanced to his clothing. He hadn't paid attention to what he was wearing. He wore his formal crimson coat, his ruffled cream-colored shirt, his black trousers and the shroud of devotion. How had that happened? Vabenok reveals one's true self, Scovis. It is a reflection of what you truly are. Your body here in Vabenok proves you are a devout. Scovis lifted the ends of the shroud, they felt so real, perhaps more than real. Joy filled his heart, and tears brimmed in his eyes. You are not forsaken, the messenger said, chuckling. Far from it. And once again I have an important task for you. Wiping the tears from his eyes, Scovis looked to the messenger. And what does my God command? To pay the ultimate price on the altar of devotion, the messenger said. So the Unspoken One can awaken. The ultimate price? Scovis wondered. Surely, that meant death. Retrieving Dreamwalker was only the beginning. The messenger waved his hand in a wide arc. In an instant the translucent field shifted, becoming the throne room in the palace at Mindolarn. Scovis marveled at the transformation, his surprised gasp the only noise in the expansive room. Aristocrats and soldiers popped into existence, all frozen in place and facing the throne room's northern entrance. A tall man, shrouded in a black mist, was frozen mid-dash like the others. Scovis could only see his vague silhouette. The mist around him was like that power used by the princes of the empire, a magic that consumed all it touched, greater than disintegrating magic. The doctrine of Cherisium claimed God himself was the originator of that power. During the War of the Gods, it was used to cleanse the wicked from Kalda. Behold the Unspoken One, the messenger said. And the reason for his fury. Scovis followed the messenger's outstretched hand, which pointed to the throne. Alanya was bound, shackled by stone before members of the royal family. Princess Raydina loomed over the High Duchess, pressing the tip of a wand to Alanya's throat. What? Scovis muttered, spinning back to face the Unspoken One. Was that him behind that black mist? Am I the... No, the messenger interrupted. The Unspoken One is another man. I don't understand, Scovis said warily. Oh, sure you do, the messenger said, his tone mirthful. Scovis swallowed hard and stared at the Unspoken One. Was that man to love Alanya? Why else would a man charge alone against the army that occupied the throne room? When does this occur? Scovis asked, waving his hand generally. 11 months from now, the messenger replied. Do I dare ask when I shall perish? If you don't ask, I will tell you, the messenger said. Your death, Scovis, has greater significance than you already speculate. Your sacrifice will save the life of another who will greatly aid the Unspoken One, for without him the Unspoken One will rot in Audiobook, and Lord Chezarith will not return. Scovis raised an eyebrow as the messenger of the promise waved his hand again. The throne room shifted, becoming the banquet yard outside the Mindolarn palace. But the banquet yard was not the only place that popped into existence, the entire skyline of Mindolarn spread as far as Scovis could see. Incredible, he thought. Blood-red clouds sparsely filled the sky, some partially obscuring a blue sun. As before, everyone in the banquet yard appeared but was frozen mid-motion. The partakers of the feast were fleeing sporadically from mages wearing the attire of palace servants, mages firing beams of violet magic. Behold the upcoming feast of sorrows, the messenger said. Scovis studied the banquet yard. It looked like that dream he had experienced before entering Vabenok. I dreamt this, Scovis muttered. The messenger of the promise harumphed. The dreams one experiences when attempting to access Vabenok are trickles of prescience that flow from this realm. They are meant to show the dreamer horrific moments of their future in an effort to deter them from walking the translucent fields. Scovis scanned the banquet yard. Most everyone was fleeing, except Princess Raydina and Prince Kyesis. Both were charging into the fray, the princess using a tefisral of some kind and the prince wielding a black sword. That sword misted blackness, undoubtedly made from the same power that veiled the Unspoken One. The messenger pointed to the rear of the banquet yard. Over there. Scovis followed the gesture. A frozen version of himself was suspended in the air, lunging toward one of those mages disguised as servants. The mage had his hand aimed at another man, a foreigner Scovis had seen several times at previous feasts. Scovis did not know the man's name, he was a Lossian, though. "You are one of the few that will fight," the messenger said. "But your actions will be the most valuable." Scovis turned from the frozen version of himself. Is this truly the future? He wondered. He waited for the messenger of the promise to reply, but he didn't. If this was the future, could he find a way to prevent this massacre from happening? If he saved lives and claimed a vision from the will, he would be seen as a true devout. Perhaps that would convince the citizens of the empire. "As I told you in the library," the messenger said, "the time for reformation is past. This attack will happen, Scovis. It must happen. Emperor Monder must die, for without his death Kiesis will not embark on the quest for Dalgalar, and it is that quest that will send the Unspoken One down the path to his awakening. Surely there must be another way." Scovis shouted. Was he really shouting at the manifestation of God's will? "There is no other way," the messenger said, shaking his head. Scovis's heart sank. Was this truly the end of his life? Tears once again brimmed in his eyes, but these were born of sorrow. "You could aid the Unspoken One," the messenger said, speaking to the speculation budding in Scovis's mind. "You could forego attending the Feast of Sorrows. You would survive, living on to traverse this realm and unlock knowledge that if shared with the Unspoken One would take him down a similar path, but that path would not stoke his fury. Knowledge without fervor rarely amounts to anything. Here, let me show you." The messenger gripped Scovis's shoulder, and the banquet yard vanished. He saw, through the Unspoken One's eyes, the events of a monumental quest to reforge an ancient power, a quest which ultimately failed. Battles were lost. His companions were slain. And the Unspoken One was banished to Audiobook, the fabled Lossian prison where wielders of magic were cut off from the source of their power. Countless years passed in that cell until the Unspoken One died. The vision changed, and Scovis saw the world and its many nations. Mindolarn continued to shrink until it was erased completely. The devouts of Cherisium also dwindled until they were no more. The vision faded and Scovis gasped and fell to his knees, exhausted. How many years had he experienced in an instant? "As you can see," the messenger said, "that path will ultimately prevent your God's second advent." Scovis stared at the ground that was once again polished obsidian. This is too much for one man to bear, he thought. His heart wrenched, and he ached for Alanya. Is there no other way? Tears trickled down his cheek, their faint splash the only sound on the translucent fields. There is no other way. Scovis bowed his head. His mind and heart broke. Your sacrifice will not go unrewarded, the messenger said. After your death you will be raised to a glorious station within the supernal ranks. You shall be esteemed as the chosen of Cherisium. Has not that been the aim of your lifelong devotion, to be counted among the great ones? Scovis sighed, but the messenger was right. He had wished to be considered as devout as the most pious of God's followers. So, Scovis Tasivir, will you obey the will of Cherisium? I will obey, Scovis whispered, his spirit broken. Good, the messenger said. When you awake, place Dreamwalker within your private library. Write in your journal that you have been studying it to prepare for the Feast of Sorrows as a means to draw closer to your God. Scovis nodded. Now, for your devotion I will bestow upon you a gift. The messenger rested his hand on Scovis's shoulder. You shall see the fruits of your sacrifice, but do not write what you are shown. The translucent field shifted, becoming a wooded grove with a quaint farmhouse and grey stone tower at its heart. Scovis stood near the trees with the messenger of the promise. Behold, the messenger said, pointing to the farmhouse, the beginning of the Unspoken One's journey to awakening. The translucent fields manifested each and every trial the Unspoken One was to endure. He was guided by a volume of prophecy written by an exile of the Carther Empire. The prophet, Sorin the Han, had also seen what Scovis was shown in the translucent fields. Throughout the visions, the Unspoken One's face was veiled by a black mist. The messenger claimed that until the Unspoken One's awakening he would remain veiled to any who saw him in the translucent fields. Near the beginning of his journey, the Unspoken One traveled to Mindolarn and there Scovis's wife aided him in his quest to unravel the mysteries of Sorin the Han. Alanya, pained by the death of Scovis, sought comfort with the Unspoken One. Jealousy welled in Scovis's heart, but the messenger reminded him that Alanya was just as important as Scovis in the Unspoken One's awakening. Alanya looked truly happy. Scovis couldn't remember the last time she had been so. Where have I gone wrong? He thought. But Alanya's happiness faded once the Unspoken One's time in Mindolarn came to an end. Empowered by his fury, the Unspoken One faced powerful foe after powerful foe. Scovis marveled at those triumphs. It was stark against the other vision he had experienced. Part of the Unspoken One's journey was to unearth the Crimson Eye, defying the sacred vow taken by the faithful. That baffled Scovis, but the messenger of the promise claimed it was necessary to usher in the return of God. Eventually, the Unspoken One traveled between worlds, a concept Scovis had assumed was pure fiction. Countless tales told of other realms, worlds not unlike Kalda. But no one had ever traveled between realms. As the Unspoken One and his band descended a mountainside in a distant realm, a feminine voice boomed across the sky, the words muddled. That voice shook the ground and Scovis fell to his knees. "What is that?" he cried. The messenger looked skyward, narrowing his eyes. Was that a scowl forming upon his face? "Your time in the translucent fields is drawing to an end," he said, his tone not amused. Scovis turned back to the Unspoken One and his band descending the mountainside. "Can I not witness the rest?" "Scovis," the voice boomed. Was that Alanya? "Oh, Scovis," resounding sobs filled the mountainside. Only Scovis and the messenger were aware of the cries. "She will rip you from here," the messenger said. "The elixir is wearing off. One of its purposes is to ensure you sleep without interruption." "Then I will return on the morrow," Scovis said. "I will return every day until the Feast of Sorrows." The messenger smiled wryly, and then everything changed. Scovis found himself lying on his back, bare-chested with sheets loosely draped over him. "What?" Scovis looked about, confused. He was in his and Alanya's bedchamber within the mansion. But he had taken the elixir in the guesthouse solarium. He blinked, and his head began to ache, a dull ache. "You're awake!" Alanya cried, crawling across the bed. She sat on her hip, nestling beside Scovis. "Oh, my love," she exclaimed, stroking his cheek. Her fingers scraped against stubble. "Stubble?" Scovis furrowed his brow. But he had shaved before retiring to bed. Alanya sighed, sounding relieved, and then kissed Scovis's forehead. "Oh, I was so worried," Alanya said, and pressed her lips to his in a passionate kiss. Scovis immediately returned her embrace. His time in Vabenak had seemed years in passing. "There's no time for that." Scovis started, interrupting their kiss. That was the messenger's voice. "What's wrong?" Alanya asked. Scovis ran a hand through his hair. His head throbbed. "My head aches," he said, taking a deep breath. "Must be that awful tea you made," Alanya said. "What was it?" Scovis didn't answer. He had been instructed not to speak of the elixir, Dreamwalker, or the translucent fields. "I'll send word to the kitchen that you're finally awake," Alanya said, rising from the bed. Finally awake? Scovis wondered. As Alanya hurried out of their bedchamber, he tossed the sheets aside. He wore only a simple undergarment, and the sheets were damp. "You need to hurry." That was the messenger again, though his voice was not rumbling. A flash of red appeared at the foot of the bed, and Scovis flinched in surprise. The messenger of the promise was standing there with his arms folded. "Quick, get dressed." "Why?" Scovis asked. Was there some other task he needed to perform? Alanya peeled back into the bedchamber. She ran through the messenger and climbed atop the bed. Scovis started. Alanya knelt beside Scovis, pouting her lips and shaking her head. All the while, the messenger looked amused. "What's wrong?" Alanya asked. Scovis arched an eyebrow and set his jaw. "You don't see him?" He pointed to the messenger. "Who?" Alanya asked, chuckling nervously. She turned around, stared right at the messenger, then returned to face Scovis. "Promise me you'll never again drink that tea." "Hurry, Scovis," the messenger insisted. Scovis ignored him and focused on Alanya. "Why were you worried?" he asked. Alanya straightened. "You've been unconscious for 3 nights, my love. I didn't know when or if you would awake." 3 nights. But that meant today was the morning of the Feast of Sorrows, the messenger said. Scovis sucked in a deep breath and eyed Alanya as he exhaled. This would be their last moment together. Tears welled in Scovis's eyes. He was not ready to say farewell to his wife. "Alanya," he said, reaching for her. Scovis pulled her close and kissed her, truly kissed her. After a short while, Scovis pulled back. Alanya rested her forehead against his, breathing quickly. "I love you," Scovis whispered. "I will always love you." Alanya grinned, intoxicated by their kiss. "Oh, I love you, too. I'm sorry I was distant." "There's no need to apologize," Scovis whispered and kissed her again. "I have to go to the feast." "What?" Alanya blurted. "Will they even let you into the palace?" So, she did know of Regant's letter. "Scovis, you don't have to go," Alanya said with a sigh. "Stay with me. Do not let her tempt you," the messenger said, his voice stern. "Go." Scovis glanced to the messenger, then to Alanya. "I must, my love." He stroked her cheek. "Regant might have excommunicated me, but I am still a devout, and I will be obedient and attend the Feast of Sorrows." Alanya slumped, a weak smile forming on her lips. "You are so dedicated. I love that about you." "Time's wasting, Scovis." The messenger tapped his wrist. What kind of a gesture was that? "I'll fetch your clothes," Alanya said, brushing back a strand of hair. Scovis scooted off the bed. "I had a book with me in the solarium. Do you know where it is?" "In the library," Alanya called and disappeared into their private dressing room. His eyes set it on your desk. Dressed in his formal crimson coat, ruffled cream-colored shirt, and black trousers, Scovis entered the 3-story library of Tasivir mansion. He walked to the far end, rounding his large dark wood desk. Dreamwalker sat upon the desk next to his journal. "Convenient," he whispered, removing a nearby quill. Faint music carried through the library's floor-to-ceiling window, the opening melody for the first movement of the Feast of Sorrows. "I need to hurry." He opened his journal and briefly recorded the incident at Hawkover's mansion. "I should leave a note so those Praetorians are paid." A mirthful chuckle filled the library, and Scovis looked up from his journal. The messenger of the promise stood on the opposite side of the desk. "A clue in your journal will suffice," the messenger said. "Don't worry. They will pay the High Duchess a visit. Now be brief." Scovis swiftly penned the words he had been commanded to write while in the translucent fields. The music, coming from the banquet yard of the Mindolarn Palace, rose to a beautiful crescendo, then faded. "Good," the word oozed from the messenger's lips. "Now go, Scovis Tasivir, and fulfill your destiny." Scovis looked up from the journal, but the messenger had vanished. My destiny? Scovis mused, turning to the towering window and eyeing the Mindolarn palace. To his surprise, he felt no fear about sacrificing himself. Perhaps it was the knowledge he had received in God's supernal realm that quashed his fears. Whatever the reason, Scovis was bolstered, enabled, empowered. He would seal his devotion with his own blood and set into motion the advent of the Unspoken One. May you find the Crimson Eye, Scovis whispered, and return our God. The end of The Price of Penitence. Read more untold tales of Kalda in A Murder on Elden Way. Glossary. A glossary of names, people, places, objects, and terms found in the Price of Penitence. Pronunciations and brief descriptions or definitions included. Acres, Akris, a servant at Hawkover's mansion. Audiold, a notorious prison in the Kingdom of Los, also known as the Castle. Renegade mages are often sentenced to Audiold, since its deepest dungeons are capable of nullifying the mustering of magic. Alanya Tasivir, Lanya Tasivir, wife of Scovis Tasivir and High Duchess of Travadia. Originally from the Isle of Sarn in the Principality of Soreth, Alanya was a member of Sarn's nobility. She is distinguished among the Mindolarnians with her dark brown hair and olive complexion. Alza Choke Samaz Nira, Alzah Shusike Siamahc Nera, a phrase used to open the mythical doorway to Vabenok once one has achieved lucidity in one's dreams. Arpran magic, Arpran a type, or channel, or magic that can heal, regenerate, and prolong life. Arpranist, a mage practicing the Arpran magical discipline. Brandleberry, Brandaleberry, a tart berry native to Kalda. It is often juiced and fermented into a wine. Cicalian, Ccah Leon, a crimson praetorian charged to guard High Oracle Regant. Channels of power, the system by which magic is categorized on the world of Kalda. It consists of 7 distinct channels, or types of magic: arcane, arpran, barshun, conjuration, elemental, manipulation, transmutation. Cherisium, a prominent religion whose followers worship the god, Cherith. Followers watch for the day when their god will return, vowing that the Crimson Eye remain hidden for all time. Once a year, followers devote to commiserate for a single week, the Days of Commiseration, in preparation for the Feast of Sorrows, a day set apart to mourn Cherith's banishment from Kalda. The most devout followers are capable of experiencing the will of Cherith. The will is a manifestation of Cherith's spirit in various forms, guiding those who he deems faithful enough to carry out actions necessary for ushering in his return. The messenger of the promise is another manifestation of the will. Followers believe that a group called the Chosen of Cherith guided the world but have since abandoned humanity for various reasons. Cherisium promises that devout followers will be sent to the translucent fields upon their deaths, awaiting the day for their god's return, where they too will return to Kalda. Cherith, the god of Cherisium who once walked among men but was exiled from Kalda. Children of the Promise, another name for the children of Cherith, or those who adhere to the tenets of Cherisium. It is an ancient term, rarely used in Kalda's current era. Choke Suzak Choke, Shusike Suzak Shusike, a vow spoken by the devouts of Cherisium. Chosen, Cherith's most devout followers, men and women who were exalted above the rest of humanity and granted supernal powers, immortality and a portion of Cherith's divinity. They are distinguished from the rest of humanity by their alabaster white skin and white hair. Glossary, Glossary, an herb used in the elixir recipe found within Dreamwalker. Conjurer, a mage who accesses the conjuration channel of magic to access the aldonal plane and the Vizurm expanse. The aldonal plane contains raw matter while the Vizurm expanse is a timeless void. Crimson Eye, the accursed instrument used to banish Cherith and the other gods from Kalda. Crimson Praetorians, an elite guard in the Mindolarn Empire, charged with protecting the royal family and other prominent members of the empire, including the leaders of Cherisium. Days of Commiseration, the 7 days preceding the Feast of Sorrows. Devoutes of Cherisium are to maintain a woeful countenance and wear the shroud of devotion. Fasting is required on the final 3 days, abstaining from food from the third to last day, then food and drink on the second to last and final days. Devout of Cherisium, Cherisium, a believer of the Cherisium religion. Dreamwalker, a tome detailing the workings of Vabenok and how to access that realm. Written by a master of dreams. Emblems of Cherisium, Cherisium, 7 symbols depicting the 7 prominent aspects of Cherisium. Ekathrum, Ekhtrum, the true name for the heart of the world. Faithful, the term used by Cherith, his chosen, and the messenger of the promise to describe certain followers of Cherisium. Thanissar, a bladed staff weapon. Variants exist throughout Kalda among both humans and elves. Typical Thanissars in the human realm consist of a single shaft, between 3 and 4 feet in length, a curving blade at one end, and a weight at the other end, often sphere-shaped. The elven variation is a double-bladed staff. Feast of Sorrows, a feast of commiseration held annually by the followers of Cherisium. First emblem, the symbol of the Cherisium religion denoting power. It resembles a long sword with a jagged fuller, pointing skyward. 6 spikes curved below the pommel, arcing upward, with 8-sided stars resting at the tip of each spike. When accessing Vabenok, the first emblem must be engraved upon the object that will open the doorway to the translucent fields. Ganyard, an herb used in the elixir recipe found within Dreamwalker. Grades, a crimson praetorian charged to guard High Oracle Regant. Halisim, an herb used in the elixir recipe found within Dreamwalker. Hawkiver's mansion, Halkiver, a mansion often used for parties in the capital city of Mindolarn. Hazais, the butler of Tasivir mansion in Mindolarn. Heart of the world, the place where the goddess Kutharn had secreted her followers, the last remaining devouts after the War of the Gods. Regant, High Oracle, Regant, the spiritual leader of Cherisium. House Tasivir, the family who has ruled the Duchy of Travadia. Kaliurn, one of Kalda's moons which shines with speckled light. Kiesis Midivar, a Mindolarn prince, the 6th son of Mindolarn, the first. Kalda, the name of the world. Karthar Empire, a long-dead empire that once ruled the known world, but was topped by a rebellion led by the Lith Luzdam. Kineticism, a sub-channel with the manipulation channel of magic, that pushes and pulls on matter. Kutharn, the daughter of Cherith, a goddess. Leyland Lake, a Tef-Israel-crafted reservoir within the Mindolarn Empire. Losian, a term for any native of the kingdom of Los. Mage, any person who is trained to access the channels of magic. Master of Dreams, a member of the Masters of Dreams who has gained mastery over manipulating the realm of Vabenok. Masters of Dreams, a secret order of devout of Cherisium who learned how to walk and manipulate the translucent fields before the rise and fall of the Karthar Empire. They were exiled from Ekathrum for heresy. Their founder wrote Dreamwalker. Mentas Midivar, the second emperor of the Mindolarn Empire. Father of Princess Raydina Midivar. Messenger of the Promise, the manifestation of Cherith's will in a humanoid form. He, however, is an entity separate from Cherith. He wears a crimson robe bearing the emblems of Cherisium. He is a gift to the faithful when Cherith and the Chosen no longer roam upon Kalda. Mindolarn, city of Mindolarn, the capital of the Mindolarn Empire, located on the southern shores of the Chaldean mainland. Mindolarn Empire, Mindolarn, an empirical nation along the southwest shores of the Chaldean mainland. Founded by Mindolarn Midivar, the first and his 6 brothers in 6360 CD. Mindolarn Palace, the Mindolarn, a 7-story mushroom-shaped structure at the heart of Mindolarn capital. It sits upon a mound surrounded by a dry moat. The grounds of the palace consist of the lower gardens, the middle gardens, and the upper gardens. A banquet yard sits at the rear of the palace, where the Feast of Sorrows is held every year. Mondar Midivar, Mon Dahr Midivahr, the sixth emperor of the Mindolarn Empire. Oberus Valaris, Obrus Vil is a master conjurer. Petrol a guard at the Tasivir mansion in Mindolarn. Prophets of the Trifica, a select group of the chosen of Cherisium, consisting of the Grand Oracle and the Supreme Warlord. Raydina Midivar, a Mindolarn princess, daughter of Mentas. Resivilin, a blood-red bird whose song is a staccato-like. Raider the chef of Tasivir mansion. Regant, high oracle, Regant the spiritual leader of Cherisium. Rogulan crystal, a type of blue crystal native to Kalda with teleporting capabilities. It is exotic matter used to catalyze conjuration portals through time and space. Rovar, a crimson praetorian charged to guard high oracle Regant. Scovis Tasivir, Scovis Tasivir, the High Duke of Travadia, husband to Alanya Tasivir. An extremely devout member of the Cherisium religion. Serenian, a tropical fish native to the equatorial oceans of Kalda. Shroud of devotion, a shawl worn by the followers of Cherisium. Nearly the length of a large man's arm span, it is made of scarlet diaphanous silk, and is embroidered with the 7 emblems of Cherisium. The first emblem is in the middle, while even emblems adorn the right and odds on the left. The shroud is worn only during the days of commiseration and the Feast of Sorrows. Soran the Han, the author of a volume of prophecy foretelling the return of Cherisium and the advent of the Unspoken One. One of the original colonizers of the Principality of Soreth. Sorothian, a term for any native of the Principality of Soreth. Suroka, a crimson praetorian charged to guard high oracle Regant. Tasivir mansion, a mansion belonging to the Tasivir family within the city of Mindolarn. Travadia, a duchy within the Mindolarn Empire. Temple of the Father, the holiest of structures in the Cherisium religion. The names of the devoutes of Cherisium are kept within its halls, inscribed upon an ancient Tef Israel. In Mindolarn, the Temple of the Father is located on the palace grounds. Tef Israel, TV Israel, any device capable of manifesting or channeling magic. Token, a phrase spoken by the faithful, choke, suask, choke. Translucent fields, another name for Vabenok. Olvilo, a large city in the eastern regions of the Mindolarn Empire. Unspoken One, the prophesied forerunner that would bring about the return of Cherisium. Vabenok, the supernal realm of the god, Cherisium, also known as the translucent fields. Vabenok can show one the past, the present and the possible future. Vavid, a crimson praetorian charged to guard high oracle Regant. Validin, a crimson praetorian charged to guard high oracle Regant. Vizurm expanse, another plane of reality, a timeless void used by conjurers to trap creatures and objects they wish to summon at a future time. Vow, the phrase spoken by the faithful, may the crimson eye remain hidden for all time. Wevid, an herb used in the elixir recipe found within Dreamwalker. Will, the shortened name for, the will of Cherisium. Will of Cherisium, Shearith, the manifestation of Cherisium's will to the mortals of Kalda. About the authors. Dan Zangari is the creator of the Legends of Kalda fantasy universe, a work in development since the early 1990s. He received a Bachelor's of Science in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Southern California and a master's degree in Systems Management. His love for science fiction and fantasy prompted the creation of this fantasy universe. When he's not writing, he enjoys reading, watching movies, spending quality time with family and serving in his local church congregation. Robert Zangari is the co-author of the various books which belong to the Legends of Kalda universe. He studied biomedical engineering at the University of Utah, however, his love for stories and storytelling took him down a different career path. When he's not writing, he enjoys spending time with his wife and daughters, playing video games, practicing martial arts and immersing himself in a good story. Other titles by Dan Zangari and Robert Zangari. For an up-to-date list of publications, visit the official Legends of Kalda website, http://www.legendsofkalda.com/books.html. Published by LOK Publishing. Tales of the Amulet. Novels. A Prince's Errand. The Dark Necromancer. Elven Secrets. The Mage's Agenda. Treachery in the Kingdom. The Red Ruby. Companion Stories. A Thief's Way. The Last Bargainist. Mysterious Assassin. Return of the Elves. A Forgotten Hero. Guardians of Kalda. Untold Tales of Kalda. Defender of Stone. Conspiracy in Kildath. Thieves among Nobles. Sorter of Mages. The Price of Penitence. Beneath the Frozen Wastes. Novels coming soon. A King's Fate. The Golden Dragons. Reign of the Black Knight. Companion Stories coming soon. A Knight's Honor. Crown of the Cavernlands. A Legend Reborn. Connect with the authors. Exclusive Readers Club. http://www.legendsofkalda.com/newsletter.html. LOK Publishing's official website. www.legendsofkalda.com. Twitter https://twitter.com/legendsofkalda. Official Facebook page https://www.facebook.com/legendsofkalda. We hope you've enjoyed this production of The Price of Penitence by Dan Zangari and Robert Zangari. Text copyright 2019 by LOK Publishing, LLC. Production copyright 2023 by LOK Publishing, LLC. All rights reserved.